Lesson 2.4 Extrusions. In this lesson you're going to learn the rules for extrusions. You're going to learn the rules for multiple extrusions. You're going to learn how to create a complex model by breaking it up into parts. You're going to learn how to control 3D viewing, and you're going to learn how to place and control a simple light source. Back to Vectorworks. Open lesson 2.4 from your exercise folder. If you haven't downloaded your exercise folders, then go back to the very first lesson. You'll find the links to the exercises there. This is exercise 2.4 and we want to look at the concept of extrusions. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit so that I can do a little bit of drawing for you. We want to look at the rules of extrusions. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a couple of rectangles and I'm going to assign them to the screen plane. So we've got screen plane, layer plane, and working plane, you might remember. I'll also put that on the screen plane, and the final one I'll put on the layer plane. You might remember when we use this to change our view, the screen plane objects do not change. So I've got a couple of rules with extrusions. Rule number one is that extrusions are always perpendicular to the plane of the object. If I select this object here, it's on screen plane. If I extrude it, so model on the menu bar, we want to choose extrude, and we'll extrude that by, we'll make that 6 feet or about 2 meters. Now when I've extruded that object, you might notice that before it had the solid white fill, now it doesn't. That's one of the things that happens with extrusions. Let's have a look. So you'll notice that this extrusion, we were looking down on top of it, it came towards us. So extrusions always go up, so they are perpendicular to the plane of the object. So it depends with a screen plane object which view you're in. So the extrusions always go perpendicular to the plane of the object. That's the first rule that you need to be aware of. This object is in screen plane and it's coming towards me, and when I extrude that, also by 6 feet, it comes towards me. So what happens when I turn my view around? That object was extruded perpendicular to the plane of the object. I can get rid of those two. I'm going to tell it not to show that anymore. So there we are. Let's have a look. We've got this object. So let's extrude that as well. Remember, it's perpendicular to the plane of the object. So when I say extrude, it will go up. And so now it makes sense. So the second rule of extrusions is that Vectorworks remembers the shape used to create the extrusion. So if I start by drawing a rectangle, and I'm going to now start to use this quick push-pull method, so I can pull that up. Vectorworks remembers the shape I drew to start with. So if I double-click on the edge, I step inside the object, I can now change the shape of that or change something about it. Put a circle on the edge. When I exit the extrusion, you can see I've got them both there. Double-click on the edge. If I select both of those and I right-click, I can do things like add surface or clip surface to clip it away. But that has now changed my extruded object. So that's another thing to remember, is that extrusions remember the shape used to create them, and you can go back and edit it later. You can change the height of the extrusion on the object info palette. Don't forget you can use plus, minus, divide, times. You might remember in the last lesson we looked at the concept of working planes, and we looked at the ability to create working planes. We looked at the ability to use automatic working planes. So how does this help? Well, if we remember the way an automatic working plane worked, extrusion is always perpendicular to the plane of the object. So when I grab that and pull it up, it's now touching the face of my object and it's coming out towards me. So it was touching the face of that object, and when I extruded it, it came out perpendicular to the face of that object. What happens when I use this face? Or this one? So it becomes very quick if you know that extrusions are always perpendicular to the plane of the object and you can get to them through an automatic working plane. It's very quick to create those objects. I'm going to clear my screen and I'm going to show you what we're going to do next, which is a cafe table, and then we're going to talk about how we break that down into chunks and build it from scratch. This is the object we'd like to create. I call it my cafe table, and I'd like you to look at it carefully. You can see there's a part at the bottom where it comes up, and then it has a sort of a waist in here, and then it comes up and there's a piece at the top. What we have is a object here which is a bit like a truncated pyramid, and then we've got a tall object here, and then we've got a flat extrusion on top. And one of the challenges with 3D modeling is to try to look at your objects and break them up into simple, manageable chunks. Let's look at a front view. If we think about it, it might be easier if we broke it up into one chunk there, and then another chunk at the top. So let's have a look at how we could break that up. So I'm going to select everything and delete it, and go to a 3D view. You might remember, double click on the rectangle tool. We want a foot which is about 14 inches, 400 millimeters, by 400 millimeters. And we want this to be centered at 0, 0. When I create models, I nearly always create them at 0, 0. That way I can use mathematics to help me build up the object. If I'm in the middle of a complex project, I will create a new design layer just so that I can build my object at 0, 0. So let's place another rectangle on top. So double click on the rectangle tool. This time it's only 4 inches by 4 inches, 100 millimeters by 100 millimeters. And now I want to select both of them. Now you might remember that we looked at extrusions, and the first rule of extrusions is they're always perpendicular to the working plane. Well, now we're going to make a multiple extrude. And the first rule of multiple extrusions is that they're always perpendicular to the plane of the object. Vectorworks takes the two objects. The one that was drawn first is always on the bottom, and the one that was drawn second is always on the top. So the stacking order of the objects is fundamental to the shape of my multiple extrusion. That's my second rule of multiple extrusions. We can change the extrusion height here. There it is. There's our multiple extrusion. Remember, you can also change the bottom Z and the extrusion height anytime you want. Let's put that back to 4 inches or 100 millimeters. Let's do that all over again. So double click on our rectangle tool, so it's a 100 by 100. Double click again, and again this is 14 inches, so it's 400 millimeters by 400 millimeters, and OK. So I've now got the same objects again. Now you might find it very difficult to select the other object unless you remember what we learnt in the first lesson, which is all about selecting. So how does that work? The first rectangle is easy to select because you can see the edge of it. Hold down the Shift key, drag your marquee, any object totally enclosed will get selected. So I've now got two rectangles. Let's go to Model on the menu bar, and we'll choose Multiple Extrude again. This time it's 600 millimeters, about 24 inches. And you notice it's upside down. Why is it upside down? Well, it's upside down because I drew it in that order. I drew the small one first, I drew the big one second, so I've now got my cone going upside down. We can go to our Object Info palette, and we can change the bottom Z to 4 inches or 100 millimeters, and now I've got one sitting on top of the other. Now I could draw my rectangle for the top just by double clicking, and we want to make this about 750 millimeters by 750 millimeters, which is about 30 inches by 30 inches. We also want to put that position at 0, 0, so click OK. And then we want to click on that and extrude that up by 50 millimeters or 2 inches. Enter once, enter again. But we need to change the bottom Z of this one. So what does that need to be? Well, it needed to be 4 inches, 100 millimeters, plus 24 inches, 600 millimeters. And now we've got the tabletop sitting on top of our legs. If we haven't done it correctly, there'll be a massive gap through here. There's not, so I've done it the correct mathematics. So the idea is that you really want to learn to break your objects up into chunks. So let's see if we can find a quicker way to do that. Now the bottom is the same. Remember, this was 14 inches, 400 millimeters by 400 millimeters, and it's 0, 0. And then double click on our rectangle tool. This one was 100 millimeters by 100 millimeters, also at 0, 0. If I select both of those, I can use my marquee, or I can use a keyboard shortcut like select all, and then model on the menu bar and multiple extrude, 100 millimeters. So what's another thing I could do? I just need to have a look at my Vectorworks preferences. Allow option click in place duplication. So make sure you tick this. On a Windows machine that says allow control click in place duplication. So make sure that's turned on, because what that means is if I hold down the option or the control key and I click, I've now created a duplicate object. If I change that extrusion to 24 inches or 600 millimeters and I change the bottom Z to 100 or 4 inches, you'll see I've got two objects, one on top of the other. Now it's not quite the way that we looked at it previously. Right click, edit, and there are my objects. You might remember the stacking order is important. So if I right click and I choose send and send to back, it'll send my rectangle, my small one, to the bottom, and that will change the shape of my middle part of my leg. Let's go back to our rectangle tool. I'm going to choose here the second mode, this one here, the corner, the center to corner mode. So automatic working plane is activated. This is 30 inches or 15 inches in this direction. So overall it's 30. We're dealing with half of the table. So that's 15 inches and 15 inches. Enter once, enter again, and there's my object. I don't want to save my document. Click. Let's bring that up by 2 inches or 50 millimeters. Enter once, enter again, and that was a much quicker way of placing that tabletop. Now the next thing that I'd like to do is to improve the quality of my rendering. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to place a simple light source. I've got a light object here. I'm going to put in directional light, click, OK, and that's a light source. And you can see straight away it's improved my rendering because now I've got light and I've got shadows. Let's have a look at our object info palette. We can control the azimuth and elevation, or we can use X, Y, and Z. I prefer the azimuth and elevation because you get a little slidey bar where you can control the azimuth, that's the direction relative to north, or the elevation, that's how high the light is in the sky. So if we set that to 45 and we set that one to 45, now as I turn my view around, the sun's not changing, so I can see the effect of the shadow on my object, which is pretty cool. I'm going to go back to a plan view because what I'd like to do is to create another extrusion here. I'm going to extrude that, so model, extrude, minus 10 millimeters or half an inch. The reason for that is that when I change my view now and I go to an OpenGL rendering, you can see I've now got, let's just click on our button at the top here, fit to objects. So there it is. Now you can see the shadow falling on the ground. Previously there wasn't a ground object, so you couldn't see any shadow falling on the ground. But I think that really helps you to understand what we're dealing with when there's a light source in the file. In this lesson, you learned the rules for extrusions. You learned the rules for multiple extrusions. You learned how to create a complex model by breaking it up into parts. You learned how to control 3D viewing. You learned how to place and control a simple light.